Okay, let's dive into this. There's been a lot happening in Los Angeles recently. It's really put a sharp spotlight on immigration enforcement, the political figures involved, sparked protests, definitely some intense debate.
Yeah, absolutely. Across different levels of government, too.
So our goal today is really to unpack this specific situation. We're talking about the federal enforcement actions that seem to trigger the unrest, the community response, on the ground.
Right.
And then these really different reactions we saw from prominent leaders. We want to understand what this flashpoint tells us about what's going on in a major American city right now.
And what's really interesting, I think, is how this connects to these deeper ongoing tensions, things that are sort of always simmering beneath the surface in a place like LA.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It immediately touched on these fundamental disagreements about, well, law enforcement approaches, the limits of federal authority in local areas, and that sometimes difficult relationship between government agencies and the communities they serve. It's a complex picture.
Definitely.
And looking closely at the information we have helps us see the different perspectives and, frankly, the pressures at play.
Absolutely. So maybe let's start with the recent events. The spark, that really ignited this latest flashpoint. The information we have describes unrest, protests erupting right after actions by Federal Immigration Enforcement, ICE.
That's right. And the protests themselves, well, the activity was described in one statement quite specifically as the violent targeting of law enforcement.
Okay, strong words.
Very. And that same statement also pointed to a specific legal context they felt was relevant. It highlighted that under federal law, it's a felony to knowingly harbor and conceal someone who is in the country illegally.
Right.
And also, it's a felony to impede law enforcement officers from doing their jobs.
So right off the bat, the description of the protests included this really strong characterization of the actions and a reminder of federal law on, aiding undocumented individuals and obstructing officers.
Exactly. It immediately framed the whole thing from a federal enforcement viewpoint, emphasizing the legal grounds for their actions and what they saw as the illegality of certain responses to them.
And the federal government's immediate reaction to that unrest, based on what we've seen, it was fast and incredibly pointed.
Oh, yeah.
A federal department directly blamed specific local Democratic leaders, naming the state governor and the city mayor for enabling this unrest.
Yes, that statement from the federal level was pretty unambiguous. It said the violent targeting of law enforcement in Los Angeles by lawless rioters is despicable.
Wow.
And it specifically called for the mayor and governor to call for it to end. It wasn't subtle at all. It was a public demand aimed right at the top state and city officials. And then another federal official echoed that strong stance, warning demonstrators directly, "You will not stop us or slow us down."
That's some powerful language. It wasn't just like an update on operations. It felt like a public, high-level political move to assign blame for the unrest.
It definitely reveals a federal perspective, at least from these statements, that sees the local political climate, maybe local policies or rhetoric, as directly helping create conditions where their agents face challenges and, well, what they described as violence.
Right.
It sort of nationalized a local incident almost instantly.
And speaking of direct language and big political names weighing in, the reaction we saw from a former president was also part of this rapid escalation. Equally pointed, equally public.
Indeed. The former president, he made a public statement that jumped right into the mix very quickly. He also put the blame squarely on the state governor and the city mayor.
What did he say specifically?
He said they can't do their jobs when it came to handling the situation.
Okay. And his description of the unrest itself, also pretty explicit, using strong terms.
Right. His statement specifically mentioned riots and looters. No ambiguity there about how he saw the protests.
So if he felt these local leaders were failing, what was his proposed fix, according to that statement?
Well, his assertion, laid out right there, was that if these local leaders couldn't handle it effectively, then the federal government will step in and solve the problem the way it should be solved. So clearly floating the idea of federal intervention as the necessary step if local control was seen as inadequate.
Okay, and this is why the back and forth gets really interesting, because the information we have includes the governor's reaction to that specific statement from the former president.
Yes, the governor responded pretty quickly, and part of his response addressed the former president, mentioning possibly deploying the California National Guard.
Ah, right, that would be part of the federal intervention idea.
Presumably, yeah. The governor called that federal suggestion and the former president's statement purposefully inflammatory.
Inflammatory, okay.
And he asserted that, in his view, those kinds of actions and words will only escalate tensions, making an already volatile situation worse, basically.
So, just based on the information we have, you see this really stark contrast emerging. One side, federal officials and the former president saying, essentially, local leaders failed, it's out of control, federal intervention, maybe even military assets, that's the answer.
Right.
And on the other side, the state governor pushing back hard, saying, no, that federal approach, that rhetoric, it's not just unhelpful, it's actively making things worse, increasing the risk.
What's fascinating there is how these differing statements right next to each other show more than just different tactics for handling unrest. One focused on decisive federal power, the other on de-escalation, local management.
Yeah.
What else? It shows fundamentally different ideas about where authority really lies and what the priority should be in moments like these. Is it federal enforcement power, border security, or is it managing the situation on the ground, trying to maintain community relations, preventing things from escalating further within this really complex urban setting? That exchange just highlights that core tension perfectly.
It really is like a small snapshot of those larger debates about federalism, state rights, local control, all playing out in real time, triggered by what's happening on the streets.
Exactly.
But, to really get a feel for the environment where this all happened and maybe why it triggered such a strong response, it helps to look at some of the background provided, the history of unrest and community tensions in LA.
Yes, that context is crucial. The information reminds us that while, a specific event often kicks things off like 1992, the verdict there, the material points to these underlying long-standing factors being huge contributors historically.
Like what kind of factors?
Things like defrustration, a sense of suffering in certain communities, tension just building up over time.
Yeah.
These create sort of fertile ground for unrest when a spark happens. That's been true in the past.
So it's rarely just about the one incident. It's the spark hitting the kindling that's been piling up.
Precisely. And the information also mentions specific historical accounts about interactions between law enforcement and LA's diverse communities that feel particularly relevant here.
Can you give some examples?
Well, drawing from those details provided, there are descriptions of alleged police misconduct over the years. Things like questioning people's immigration status during routine encounters, alleged threats to call federal immigration back then the INS, even reports of hate speech based on ethnicity or origin during stops, and demanding documents in ways people felt were discriminatory or harassing.
And the perspective offered in that material is that these kinds of historical interactions where people feel targeted or threatened because of their background.
Yeah.
And this idea, this view that portrays immigrants as invaders or sort of equates being fully human or having rights only with being a U.S. citizen, that these attitudes and experiences can really contribute to tension and this feeling of unfair treatment, building distrust towards authority.
And this documented history raises a key point. How do these past patterns, especially around immigration status and interactions with law enforcement, which are explicitly mentioned regarding the city's past, how do they shape how recent ICE actions are seen and reacted to today?
Right. It suggests that for many people in LA, these federal immigration enforcement events aren't just isolated incidents.
Exactly. They might be felt through the lens of this longer documented history of related tensions and experiences. This background really helps us understand the complex emotional and political environment surrounding the recent protests, just based on the info we have.
Yeah, it provides that critical layer of context. It shows the recent events aren't happening in a vacuum, but against this backdrop of documented historical tensions involving the very same issues. Immigration, community relations, law enforcement authority. It adds real weight to understanding the intensity of the community's reaction as it was presented.
It clearly connects the specific trigger, the enforcement actions, to a much longer story of community experiences and their relationship with different levels of authority. It highlights why this particular issue can be so volatile in this specific city.
So let's try and wrap this deep dive up. We've looked closely at the recent immigration enforcement actions in LA, the significant protests they triggered, described in very strong terms by federal officials.
Right.
And that really sharp public back and forth that followed. between federal leadership, the former president, the state governor, the city mayor, each offering a very different take on the problem and the solution.
And throughout this, we've highlighted the different levels of authority and really the fundamental perspectives at play, just based on what the information reveals. You've got the federal government's immediate focus on enforcement, the legality around harboring or impeding officers, the border security rhetoric, contrasted with the state and local government's focus, at least as shown by the governor's response, on managing things on the ground, de-escalation, dealing with complex community relations, especially when faced with what they saw as inflammatory federal moves.
It's a clear clash of priorities and powers.
Absolutely. A collision course, you could say.
So here's a final thought for you listening. Considering how quickly the rhetoric escalated from political leaders at all these different levels in response to these recent events, and keeping in mind LA's documented history of unrest tied to these deep-seated tensions, especially around law enforcement and community interactions concerning things like immigration status, what does this moment suggest about the future? How will immigration enforcement, community concerns, and political power interact and potentially clash in major American cities going forward? Something to really think about as these dynamics keep playing out.